Right now, I have an enormous pleasure because our first spotlight speaker is someone I've gotten to know and admire and really am proud of. So please join me in welcoming my good friend, Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. Welcome. So happy to see you. So happy to see you.
Same here.
Yeah, I mean, this is an amazing group. I know you've been briefed about where they come from and who they are, and these are your kind of people, Pete. These are people who like to get things done and make a difference. And let's start off with the fact that you were elected mayor of South Bend, Indiana, at the age of 29, just a few years older than most of the audience here. So what inspired you to run for office at such a young age?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. This is a great honor. I've really been looking forward to it. And you're right, I got to know a few of the students on the way out here, and I'm so excited about what they're up to. So I come from South Bend, Indiana, which is best known for the University of Notre Dame being there, but it's actually an industrial city. It was built around the Studebaker Auto Company. It was a company town for a company that stopped existing in the 1960s. And even though that happened decades before I was born, I grew up still in the shadow of that. The city was still kind of picking its way out of that, lost tens of thousands of people and wasn't quite sure what it was going to be. Right around the time I entered the race for mayor, there was a national story about American so-called dying cities, and we were one of them. And the article about all the reasons that our city was supposedly dying focused on the fact that there were a lot of statistics showing young people were leaving at a troubling rate because of a perceived lack of opportunity. And so I saw that not only was my hometown that I cared about struggling, but that struggle, it turned out, specifically had to do with the presence or the loss of young people. And I thought, well, I'm young. I care about this city. And I started getting together with some of my old friends who, like me, had assumed that success meant leaving, but would come back together around Thanksgiving or holidays or whatever the occasion, get together over a drink and say, what's going on? What would it take for our city to come back? And somewhere along the line in those conversations, the light bulb went off that anytime you find yourself repeatedly using sentences that begin with "why don't they?"
Why don't they? Right.
Why don't they stop thinking Studebaker's going to come back? Why don't they bring some life to downtown? Why don't they reanimate the social life of this city? You start thinking, why don't I? Why don't we? Right? We could do something about that. Right. And we did, and it worked.
Yeah.
That was the amazing thing. We had no idea when I set out to run for mayor that we would succeed. I was up against much better known names in local politics. But I also found that an older generation of people, I think, really sympathized with a wave of young people who said that we wanted to shape the trajectory of our city differently. And I'm very proud to say that team we put together over the course of that 8 years that I was mayor really did create what I would call the comeback decade of our city, changed the trajectory on everything from population to economics, and just built my faith in what people can do when you get together and say, why don't I?
Well, I think that's such an important point, because it's true that people often see a problem and want somebody to fix it and don't think that, hey, I could be that somebody, and who can I get to work with in order to make that happen? So this is an audience of young leaders and entrepreneurs, many of whom are in their early and mid-20s. And when we think about the issues that they're confronting today, do you still have that same sense of optimism that if people decide that they can get together and find common cause and work on a problem, that something good can happen? Because there's a lot of discouragement out there. Yeah. There's a lot of people who are kind of overwhelmed by the steady barrage of bad stories and scapegoating and finger pointing. So how do you think about this time, which is a little more challenging for people to find their place?
There's no question. The level of negativity and the mechanisms that exist to create an amplification of that negativity are, I think, in certain ways unprecedented, in other ways probably par for the course when you're trying to do big things. But they have collided over the heads of, I think, the generation now with the most at stake. Because your generation will be called to solve some of the toughest things that humanity's ever faced, which will require some of the most successful, extensive, and disciplined, coordinated action that humanity's ever attempted. So that's certainly true when it comes to the climate challenge, just to choose one. And so on some level, we have no choice but to push away that negativity. And also, I think that there have been things, even in this very challenging time, that have demonstrated what can be done. And I would point, at risk of sounding a little immodest, to what we're doing in this administration right now. Mm-hmm. I mean, in 2 years, some of the most significant industrial policy of the post-war era, an infrastructure bill that obviously I'm very proud to be working on and excited about, that's putting the most investment into things from highways and bridges to ports and airports since the Eisenhower years. These things are being achieved not just by President Biden, though I'm very proud to be working under his leadership, not just by our administration, though I'm proud to be part of it, not just by elected officials, but by a country that has in fact managed to coalesce into certain majorities, not just congressional majorities, but national majorities, to get some of this big stuff done. I was just today, I was in Glendale, Kentucky, a couple hours from here. Somebody knows Glendale. All right, nice. So you know how your home is going to be transformed by this facility creating electric batteries, or for batteries for electric vehicles. Thousands of jobs. And there are thousands of jobs right now just building this thing. I mean, it is enormous, millions of square feet. And then, of course, there'll be thousands of good-paying jobs doing the actual work. The very same kind of good-paying jobs that propelled the arrival of my hometown 100 years ago and put so many people into the middle class. And nobody there was talking about the politics of EVs, and nobody was talking about red and blue. The local officials, I think most of them were probably Republican. I don't know, it didn't come up. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so these things are possible even in this moment, which is good news because they're important, especially in this moment.
Yeah. Well, I know a little bit about receiving criticism and backlash, just a little, and how often partisanship gets in the way of, doing what needs to be done, or even telling the real story about what is happening. And look, there's been a lot of misinformation and confusion about this terrible derailment in East Palestine, Ohio. And because I was in the Senate for 8 years and follow a lot of this, I kind of know what really happened, but that doesn't help when there's an alternative narrative that is really trying to create problems instead of solve the real challenges. Can you tell us a bit about who does what when there is a derailment like this, and how we can prevent that from happening, and really what's going on now?
Yeah. So just a few days ago, I was in East Palestine, Ohio, and it's a community of people who, through no fault of their own, have had their lives turned upside down by this terrible situation. A train derailed. It was carrying a number of hazardous materials, some of which had to be burned off in order to prevent explosions that would have been even more devastating. And they're asking questions. Is my home safe? Is the air safe? Is the water safe? Is the soil safe? And what hasn't come through in some of the media narratives is that there was a federal response from the first hours. Not just my department that was on the ground, but importantly, the EPA, which really takes the lead on things like holding Norfolk Southern accountable for this cleanup and the testing that's needed. And more recently, FEMA and other agencies. When you have a disaster like that, the National Transportation Safety Board comes in. NTSB is independent from my department for a very good reason, which is they need an independent way to look and make recommendations on everything that could have been different, what the company could have done differently, but also what the government could have done differently, so we can make better policies. Our role includes the policy framework for making sure these things don't happen again. And so what I found on the ground was not only the need to make sure that these residents are getting their questions answered and getting the support they deserve, but also we've got to honor them and every community that sits along a railway line. And so many of you may have found where you live, you look at those tank cars a little bit differently when they move on a train through your hometown or your neighborhood after what happened, to make sure we're raising the bar on railway safety, which is not an easy thing to do because, frankly, there's a very powerful lobby that has been very effective at even watering down some of the things that were put in over the years. But I also think there's a moment here because there will be a very clear moment of truth among people who have gotten involved and gotten on television to talk about this issue. That will demonstrate, I think, whether they are prepared to honor the people of East Palestine or whether they were just there to use them.
Right.
Because we're about to move forward on a lot of reforms.
Yep.
Some things we were working on the whole time. Other things there's new energy to do more with around a higher standard for the strength of those tank cars so that they're less likely to puncture or be damaged. Around the accountability for railroad companies, which sometimes pay legal maximum of a six-figure fine, which doesn't mean much to a multi-billion-dollar company. We could change some of that. Some of it we're doing on our own, but some of it requires Congress to help us change. So this is a put up or shut up moment for a lot of people who were part of the conversation. And I will say, to their credit, I've seen people on both sides of the aisle working on this issue.
Right.
I'm ready to work with them to get real things done. And the rest is politics. And one thing I'm not going to do is complain about any frustration associated with coming to an agency and having work to do every day and finding that you're dealing sometimes with a noise machine that seems to have little to do with your day-to-day work and a lot to do with perceptions about your real or perceived role in presidential politics. It would be very indecent of me to complain of that sitting next to you. So the real important thing is just what can we get done?
Well, I think that's exactly the right attitude to take. I do think, and I've appreciated your setting the record straight and firing back at some of the disinformation, because in this fast-moving information ecosystem, people hear things and it's kind of here today, gone in a minute, and they don't know what to believe. There's so much room for confusion. So I think it's important to stay focused on the job, but also, when appropriate, to respond. And you're excellent at doing that. When you read about your biography, your accomplishments, you're often described as a trailblazer. You are the first openly gay cabinet member. You're the youngest. Person to ever hold the office of Secretary of Transportation. You're one of the youngest people to make a serious bid for the presidency. So there's no doubt that along the way, being the first often requires knocking down some barriers, some misconceptions. What message do you want to convey to our CGI U students about forging your own path, being true to yourself? Because you went through a lot of soul searching, and you were in the Army, you served in Afghanistan, you were incredibly successful as a student, you were a Rhodes Scholar, but then you also had to come to grips with who you actually were and how you wanted to live your life. And it was courageous, and yet it's also a good reminder that as we sit here in this beautiful auditorium at this great university, there are millions of people around the world grappling with some of the very same issues and questions you did.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm humbled to have a word like trailblazer used when I'm sitting next to you and knowing all the but I am mindful of how things changed for me when I was able to come forward and realize that it was time to be who I was and let the consequences be what they might. What happened was I was deployed to Afghanistan. For the record, I should say it was a Navy reservist, but they had me doing Army stuff.
Yeah.
Kind of how it works sometimes in the military. And one of the things you do when you go on a deployment is you sit down and you write a letter, just in case. And I was writing that letter. I was already sitting mayor at the time and had a great life, a great house and great friends and meaningful work. But as I was going through that process of writing the letter that my loved ones might have to open if I didn't come back, one of the things I had to think about was that at that age, I had no idea what it was like to be in love. And I thought for all the things I'd been able to do and see and experience, that was not a tenable situation, and that if I did come back okay, which thank God I did, I would do something about that and get on with that part of my life. But what that meant was putting an awful lot at risk, because through those years, my career consisted of two things. And I don't know which one was less friendly to being gay when I got into it. One was military service, which was still, at the time I first joined, a matter of policy that you'd be fired if you're openly gay. And the other was elected politics, public service in Indiana, which is not known for being the most LGBTQ-friendly state. Matter of fact, this was during the Pence administration back in Indiana. But I knew that it was just time. And what I found, and I guess the thing that I hope anyone wrestling with anything remotely like that today knows, is that what seemed then like a threat or an obstacle became a huge part of what I actually had to offer. What I mean by that is not only that it turned out I was able to get reelected as mayor after coming out in an election year, and that I was able to build the presidential campaign that I did, and that later on President Biden appointed me to be the first confirmed cabinet secretary who was openly gay. It wasn't about what I was able to get done, but the fact that part of what my service and campaign meant to people only existed because of that very thing that I thought would make it all impossible. The very thing I thought would multiply all of any hopes I had about public service on a large scale, thought it would multiply all of that by zero, wound up being a really important part, unintended and not sought after, but very meaningful, of what I had to offer. People would come up to me, sometimes still do, especially sometimes somebody from an older generation. I remember in an airport, one guy coming up to me and reached out to shake my hand, and he didn't say a word. He couldn't say a word. There were tears in his eyes, but we had an entire conversation. I understood what he was saying about what my just being able to plausibly run meant for him. And I couldn't even imagine the amount of lived experience and fear and pain behind the things that he was saying just by shaking my hands and looking me in the eye. And some version of that happened 1,000 times over on the campaign. And so even though I didn't think my public service was about that, I don't. I mean, my public service at the moment is about transportation policy. I know that the very thing that I once thought would have made me ineligible to do this kind of service has actually become part of what I have to offer. And so look for ways in which what feels like your biggest obstacle might not only be an obstacle you will overcome, but very much a part of the impact that you are going to make.
Amen. That's absolutely the case. You know, we have students from all over the world, and they're here because they want to be change makers. They want to be trailblazers. They want to make a difference, solving problems, both personally and professionally, and in many cases even politically. So when I think about what they are going to be going through in the years ahead. As a leader, what excites you to get up in the morning and get to work? And what is the biggest worry that you have about our country and the world in terms of the challenges that we face?
Well, usually the thing getting me up in the morning now is our toddlers, who have no respect for our desire or need for sleep. But also, of course, in a grander sense, that propels you. I mean, we have twin 18-month-olds, and that really makes you take the future more seriously than ever. What I'm really propelled by is the knowledge that we're in this moment, kind of both of the halves of your question, actually, the opportunity in front of us. The reason I believe, for all the challenges we're dealing with in transportation right now, this is the best job in the federal government, which is that we're building the future, like literally building what America's future is going to look like, and with that, building livelihoods and building American competitiveness and American success, and contributing, I think, to the world's success in confronting global challenges like climate. But also the ferocious challenges that do face us. This divisiveness that has made it so difficult to get even manifestly good things done. And also, in our country, I think the very real risk of stasis in our political institutions. The most elegant feature of the Constitution is that it contains the capacity to revise itself, the amendment process, which has been used on average about once a decade over the history of our country, but hasn't really been touched in a meaningful way in half a century. And I use that as just one example of the need for our country to be ready to refresh itself in terms of our institutions, in terms of our toolkit for making policy, for making law, for meeting the moment, because the moment is like nothing we've seen before. Again, whether it's in my particular slice of it, the transportation portfolio, and everything that we are about to face from, I keep mentioning the climate challenge, but technological developments like artificial intelligence, whose implications for transportation we're only just beginning to understand. All the way through to the geostrategic concerns that I think shape the way the U.S. Interacts with the rest of the world. It is going to require us to have a level of imagination that I'm not sure even now we fully acknowledge or admit or recognize. And so much will depend on whether we do, because I think that it will be decided largely in this very decade whether we successfully meet those challenges, or whether we get to the middle of the century and instead of my kids kind of being small enough to sit in our lap and try to read Goodnight Moon, they'll be sitting across the table over a meal saying, "Dad, why didn't you do more? Mm-hmm. Why didn't you capture that moment?" That's what really keeps me going.
Well, I think that's a really important point, because young people have so much power, and a lot of it is unused. There's a lot of things going on in your life, in your late teens, your early 20s, many distractions, all kinds of, worries and wonders about your own life and the path forward. But the young people of the world on every continent actually hold the balance of political power to decide whether or not people will make the decisions that will shape the future. So in the remaining 2 minutes, Pete, give us, a call to action that would especially connect with young people, literally from 92 countries, who have much more power than they sometimes understand, and certainly that they utilize.
What a great note to end on. And I agree with you. That's where so much power lies. That's where some of our most important decisions are going to come down to, is whether young people mobilize to shape our future for the better. I'll use an example that is more specific to my field of U.S. transportation policy, but then I'll suggest why it's important writ large. as I mentioned, I'm very proud of this $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill, about half of which is in transportation, with funds that are moving through my department out around the country on everything like the airport in Nashville that we celebrated improvements at today to ports that are going to help us with our supply chains. What's interesting is most of those dollars actually go into the hands of cities or counties or states that are coming up with the actual projects. We're just funding them. We're helping. We're doing everything we can to help with the delivery, but we're not thinking up the projects in Washington. The ideas aren't all coming from Washington. The funding is. And so if you really wanted to shape what was going on with this giant national $1 trillion bill, the best thing you could do is to be present where a decision is being made closer to home, like a city council meeting or a state legislative process where these decisions really cash out. And young people have an enormously important voice in that. I have seen myself, back when I was mayor, I've seen votes on our city council go differently just because a handful of students, one by one, got up and took the mic during the portion of the meeting that was dedicated to public comment and changed the way everybody thought about things. Some of them weren't even old enough to vote. They had something else, and this is what I really want to leave you with. Whether you were at a planning board meeting in a community near you, weighing in on an infrastructure project, or participating in the governance of an educational institution through a student body, and you're in any country in the world, there is a level of moral authority that you have that is an enormous advantage in being heard. I know all the reasons you're conscious of the disadvantages of being heard, or trying to be heard, that come with being young and trying to be taken seriously. But the other side of the coin is a moral authority that comes from being able to look into the eyes of the people who are making the decisions that will shape your lives. At my tender age of 41, I just noticed during this interaction that I have aged into the process where when I talk about why climate change matters so much, I'm doing it more in terms of my children's future than my own. It's part of the process of growing older, I guess. But you're able to ask people whether they are doing right by you. And since so many of the decisions, good or bad, that are being made right now really come down to whether we would sacrifice the long term to do what's right for some kind of short-term expediency, whether that short-term expediency is profit, or whether it's political reward, or whether it's clicks. You are walking ambassadors of the long term, of the future. And when you ask those questions, they rate a very serious answer. So I hope you will deploy that extraordinary moral authority, which amounts to a kind of power, whenever a decision is being made that affects your future.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Secretary Buttigieg. Thank you. Thank you so much. We'll go off this way. Thanks, everybody. That was perfect.